The reporting from the German press is quite grim, where European leaders came away from the meeting under the assumption that Trump is not going to be deploying more pressure on the Russians. The White House put out a statement essentially telling the Europeans that they need to put more pressures on the Russians by implementing more energy sanctions. Mind you, it was the Europeans that was asking for a way to do it together, and it is Donald Trump's friends in Europe, Viktor Orban and Fico, that are the biggest consumers of Russian energy export. And it was Trump himself, again, who pressured the Ukrainians to stop bombing the pipelines that gives them that product. Mind you, about bombing, NATO had to scramble jets as Russia launched more than 500 drones and missiles at Ukraine, and there were drones that entered Polish airspace. Russia launched more than 500 drones and missiles into Ukraine overnight into Wednesday morning, according to Ukraine's Air Force, with explosions reported across the west in the country and aircraft scrambling across the border in Poland. Russia launched 502 attack and decoy drones, plus 24 missiles in the latest overnight barrage. Ukraine's Air Force said in a Telegram post, defending forces downed 430 drones and 21 missiles. The impacts of 69 drones and 3 missiles were recorded across 14 locations, the Air Force said, and falling debris and downed munitions reported at 14 locations. The barrage appeared to target several Ukrainian regions, with local authorities reporting explosions in the western regions of Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Khmelnytskyi, and Lutsk. The head of the Kiev administration said that at least one drone crashed in the capital. One person was killed. The head of the regional administration wrote on Telegram, 2 missiles and 3 drones were shot down over the region. Lviv mayor said 15 Russian drones attacked the city, which sits around 40 miles from the Polish border. A warehouse was partially destroyed with no casualties reported. The thing is, these drones crossing the border into Poland are becoming more and more common, and they are happening. And at one point, you have to ask yourself, is this an attempt by Russian authorities to probe and to see if they can get away with moving their air assets into NATO airspace without repercussion? And as Trump has shown himself to be, quite frankly, limp-wristed in dealing with the Russians, would they be so bold? They were so bold during the Biden administration. You can assume, if you want, that this is a mistake and that their munitions are crossing into NATO airspace and making impact on accident. But when it's destroying local infrastructure, when it's hitting locations in Poland, and when it happens again and again and again, even if it's on accident, there is still something that's read by the Russians from that. Dylan, did you read the report that the U.S. will be reducing assistance to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? Yes, I have read the report. In fact, I have the report right here from the Financial Times. The U.S. is to phase out security assistance programs for European armies along Russia's border as it pushes the continent to pay for more of its own defense. Pentagon officials last week informed European diplomats that the U.S. would no longer fund programs that trained and equipped militaries in Eastern European countries that would be on the front line of any conflict with Russia, people familiar with the matter said. Spending for the Pentagon program, which falls under an authority known as Section 333, must be agreed by the U.S. Congress, but the Trump administration has not requested any more money. Funds already approved will be available until the end of September 2026. A White House official said the move aligned with President Trump's efforts to reevaluate and realign foreign aid and correspond with an executive order he issued on his first day in office. Mind you, all of this is read by Putin. All of this is taken as a signal. All of this is seen as the United States reducing support for those who would be most at risk for Russian expansionism. At the same time that the Trump administration is trying to send the signal that is an increasing pressure on the Russians and that they can't wait the West out. But this is an easy way to read as you can wait the West out. And so if he's really interested in pressuring the Russians to think that they can't continue not only Russian expansionism outside of Ukraine, but in Ukraine itself, this ain't the way to do it. Or if you're going to do stuff like this, you're going to have to send a counterpoint so substantial that it is impossible to misread. For example, passing the Lisa Murkowski bipartisan aid bill that's currently sitting in the Senate with no way towards the deaths of Mike Johnson or Donald Trump. Here is the article from the Kiev Independent talking about the 2 drones that entered Polish airspace 2 drones entered Polish airspace overnight on September 3rd during that massive drone attack, but were not shot down as they posed no danger, according to the Polish Armed Forces operational commander. Mind you, if they enter Polish airspace, they could still turn around and attack Lviv and attack other places and then be a danger to other people. And Poland acknowledges that dangers to Ukraine is dangers to Poland. So I don't know about that. If they're using Polish airspace to attack Ukraine, they should stop that. The violation comes weeks after a Russian drone crashed into eastern Poland, which officials described as a deliberate provocation. Deliberate, meaning that Russia did it on purpose. We had 2 airspace violations, said the news conference. These 2 violations were under the full control of national forces and units assigned to the state and defense system. The drones left Polish territory without causing damage, Poland's German chief of staff said. Polish general chief of staff said. Look, if they're using Poland's airspace to bomb Ukraine, it's not the same as bombing Poland, but it is still illegally using their airspace to illegally invade Ukraine, and you should not facilitate that. And if you're trying to convince the Russians that you're willing to deploy your troops in there post-war, well, by God, you might as well be willing to show them that you're shooting down their drones during the war now. God, man. We should talk about the redeployments. So I want to talk about Russian redeployments and Russian offensive operations. See, summer is almost over in Ukraine, and most people remember, if you were following the front line or following reports of what was to be expected, talks of a Russian summer offensive. And some people have asked, well, where was that offensive? Well, it happened. It did happen. It happened across the front line. There were attempts to attack in Sumy. There, of course, is the Ukrainians dealing with the fighting around Kupiansk, which looks quite dangerous right now with the river crossed and Kupiansk being flanked from the north. That is something that, of course, is worrying Ukrainian mill bloggers and Ukrainian forces in the region that are trying to defend the Kharkiv region and protect the gains of the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive. But we saw most of the pressure, as is to be expected, in the Pokrovsk region, where we saw, while to the south, the Russians haven't advanced that much, maybe a kilometer or 2, as they've tried to push into Pokrovsk, and infiltrators have again and again and again been prevented from entering the city center as they continue to fight to the suburbs to the south of Pokrovsk. The Russians have tried to advance their encirclement around Pokrovsk. They have advanced it to the west, and they have advanced it probably most aggressively and most notably to the north, with the 10-kilometer penetration in the direction of the Dobrpila-Kramatorsk highway, creating a big scene before Azov and other forces were redeployed to the area to take the situation under control. But when it comes to Pokrovsk itself, even though it's encircled on 3 sides, even though the roads into Pokrovsk are under immense pressure from drones, and they are pretty deadly, even though the Ukrainians are making the Russians suffer quite large casualties going into Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk still holds, and the Russians, as I said before, are taking quite substantial casualties. The same is also true for the city of Konstantinivka, which is not as encircled as the city of Pokrovsk, but you can see that the Russians are trying to push for a type of encirclement like that as they push to the north, and as they continue to try to make pushes on the western side of the city, northward, to try to create a 3-way encirclement. But all of these advances have been taken under heavy drone attack and fire from Ukrainian forces, with the convoys that they've tried to run up these roads getting absolutely eviscerated, and the infantry assaults being resisted every step in the way with high casualties. You can see these casualties everywhere. You do not just need to take my word for it. You can see it in the reports across Russia and from the mainstream press like the BBC, who could show you publications from cities 4,000 miles away from Ukraine and Russia, where people are suffering from casualties and wounds from the war, from drones, from mortars, from the different attacks, from the advance. But you can also see it on the geography of Ukraine itself. Here is footage showing the lead up into Pokrovsk, which is absolutely littered with burnt out vehicles, burnt out armored vehicles, civilian vehicles that have been retrofitted for military use, and different Russian forces that had tried to progress into the city, but had again and again been intercepted by largely Ukrainian drones, which are causing the vast majority of Russian casualties at this point. This is just a small strip of road into the city of Pokrovsk, and you can see the type of casualties that the Russian army is facing trying to push in. It's not that they haven't made any progress, is that the progress that they have made has been slow and it has been at high costs. And with the recruits that they're taking in becoming more and more expensive and older, with the average age of a new Russian recruit being between the ages of 40 and 60, well, you can't do this forever. You can't throw these men in these types of offensives forever at current recruitment rates. You're either going to have to continue to increase the payouts for the recruitment to try to get more recruits and accept the fact that they're not going to be the youngest of the young. Even if you try to increase the initiatives to recruit more young people in Russia, more older people are available. And if somebody's a debtor, you take them where they are. Either way, the Russians do need to continue to recruit more men. That cost is going to continue to increase, and the cost on society of the injured and wounded having to be supported will also continue to increase. But Russia has been able to largely keep up its recruitment, even though it's had to do it at high costs to its budget. But even while keeping up recruitment, that has not been enough to produce the battlefield outcomes that the Russian government wants. They have not had enough forces in the Dobrapila and the Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka access to make the progress that they wanted. They wanted Pokrovsk by now. I remember reading from the different pro-Russia accounts late last year about, oh my gosh, Pokrovsk is in free fall, XYZ. It's now a year later. And when we talked about the south of Pokrovsk, they're about where they started. When you talk about the north of Pokrovsk, you talk about the encirclement of Pokrovsk. Yes, they've made progress. Yes, they've put Pokrovsk under immense pressure, but Pokrovsk is still holding. And so it seems that the Russians have changed tactics. What I'm showing you right now is some images from War Unit Observer, who made some marks to show you exactly where these tanks are coming from. These are T-90 and reformed and updated T-72 tanks that are being redeployed to the Donetsk Oblast. They're being redeployed to fight on the Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka fronts, and there are actually quite a few Russian mechanized brigades and motor rifle regiments that are being sent into the area. For example, these TM-90s and TM-72s are being moved from the Kherson region to occupied Donetsk, and they're linked to the 17th Tank Regiment and the 70th Division, part of the 18th Army. There's also the 24th, the 26th, and the 28th Motor Rifle Regiments of the 70th Division, which are also on the move into the region. Russia's 155th and 40th Marine Brigades have already arrived into the Donetsk region as of speaking right now, with the 155th being expected to reinforce the Dobrapila axis, while the 177th Regiment is also believed to be not too far behind and should be deployed into the area not that long from now. A lot of these troops are being redeployed, as we said, from Kherson, but some of these troops are also being redeployed from Sumy. The Russians have had a lot of problems in Sumy, while the Russians have been able to make some gains in Sumy, and if you go to Sumy right now, you can see that the Russians are still occupying parts of Sumy. They have not had the gains that they wanted. What the Russians wanted was to redeploy enough Ukrainian troops by pressuring all these different parts of the front line that they wouldn't be able to hold all the different parts of the front line, and somewhere they would get a penetration. But the penetration certainly didn't happen in Sumy, as the Ukrainians were able to launch localized counteroffensive that even took some of the villages that the Russians captured, and the troops in this area have taken high casualties. I've seen them myself. I've seen the corpses myself. It's quite vile, but I've seen them myself, and they have taken high casualties. These units have had to rely on thermal blankets covering themselves, crawling through the forest, and to make quite a large advance from the border all the way into occupied Ukraine. And that has been a downward pressure on their advance, because the Russians do not want to use the armored vehicles, which they don't have an endless supply of, as they've burnt through much of their old Soviet reserves. Crazy to believe. It would be crazy to believe before the war, but now here we are. And so they've had some struggles there, and so they've decided to redeploy it to the area where they have seen some advances as of late, which is, as we've said before, the Donetsk region. So from the Sumy region and from the Kherson region, we're seeing redeployments in this direction to try to put more pressure towards Konstantinivka and towards the Pokrovsk three-way encirclement. And so they can turn that failed, or at least not as successful as first saw out, 10-kilometer penetration towards the Dobropila-Kramatorsk highway. They can redeploy troops into that area so they can re-add pressure, especially as the Ukrainians have engaged in some localized counteroffensives in the area. If you look north of the Pokrovsk three-way encirclement, you can see that they have done some localized counteroffensives in this way, taking back some of the villages and suburbs surrounding the eastern side of Pokrovsk towards their penetration, the Russian penetration in this direction, which obviously, when you see how close or how short this line is that the Russians have to sustain and where the Russians were penetrating, you could have the fear of an encirclement. And that's something Russian commanders have to think about. And that's probably what is deriving their troops, because the last thing the Russian commanders want is to force the Russians to keep attacking, continue to make nominal progress, and after 6-7 months from now, get encircled because you overstretched your lines. And so you want to reinforce your lines. And that's what these redeployed troops are doing. It's also to be believed that the Russians want to engage in an offensive going into the fall and winter. That the Russian summer offensive, they want to keep up the pace. And as we said before, I didn't really expect the Russian summer offensive to be the end of it or for them to take a break after, because through most offensives, what the Russians have not done is stopped. They might have quieted down, they may have slowed down their offensives, but they always try to keep as much pressure as constant as possible. And with current Russian philosophy being that the Ukrainians are overstretched, that their forces are undermanned, that they don't have enough men to hold the line, and that the line is being held up by Ukrainian drone warfare, continued swarms of their men crawling through the bush, using the greenery for the moments of summer that they still have before the fall and winter sees the leaves fall and no longer provide cover for advancing Russian troops. There's also going to be a fear for Ukrainian artillery and teams that use those same leaves for cover as well. But for advancing Russian troops, for the men who more often have to leave cover to make assaults, outside of those having to just leave cover to either get to your position or move between positions, it's going to be quite a struggle. So I think they're trying to use the greenery while it's still there. They're trying to use the bushes. They're trying to use the trees. They're trying to use the tree lines while the leaves are still there, because once those leaves fall and if you can see the Russians moving between those tree lines, you throw some mortar shells, you throw some artillery shells, or of course you throw some FPV drones. And if the FPV propellers can't get through the branches, well, you can always drop grenades on them with a Mavic. Or wait till nighttime and let the vampires or the night bombers deal with them. Point is, they want to utilize the time window they have before winter sets in. And so I think fall is going to be a pretty aggressive time period. The redeployments seem to indicate it. And I think the weather is going to change the geography in Ukraine to make it less advantageous for these Russian soldiers who are trying to use thermal blankets to get through the fields. But the fields are not green and the tree lines are not green, and you're just trying to use a thermal blanket. It's going to get a lot harder. It's already hard to do what they're doing. It's going to get harder with less leaves and less greenery covering what they're doing. So I expect, if you want a prediction from me, and I'm not the first person to look at these signs and say this, I don't want to say it's revolutionary, but I expect the Russians to not only keep up the pressure, but I expect these redeployed troops to try to increase the pressure. I've seen by some accounts, some OSCEN accounts, some that follow me, some people who are in service, talk about how they expect more tank lines. And when you see redeployed, tanks, when you see these redeployed armored vehicles, armored assaults, more armored assaults isn't to be completely unexpected. But I don't expect the Russians to just take a gigantic mechanized wave and just throw it at the region. That could lead to catastrophe, and they could burn through a lot of the reserves that they're going to need for the rest of this year going into 2026. And they're not producing enough armored vehicles to replace the rate of loss that they would have to engage in for that strategy to bear any success outside of burnt out metal abstract art in Ukrainian farm fields. Point is, I think that there are going to be some offensives this winter and fall. And the Ukrainians are monitoring the Russians redeploy their troops to the region. They want to capture Pokrovsk before year's end. They want to capture Konstantinivka before year's end. I even think they want to capture Dobrobila before year's end. And if they can do that, then the pathway to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk is right there. And if they can do that, and they can move substantially to the west, maybe they can avoid Ukraine's western belt of Donetsk fortresses and defenses entirely, and try to completely usurp that movement and not have to take Kramatorsk head on. Either way, I think this is their goal. I think their goal is to redeploy their forces and try to take Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka by the end of the year. Whether they succeed in doing that is a totally different story. But I would say Pokrovsk is probably the city that's in the most precarious position. And while there have been some localized counteroffensives, and the 10-kilometer penetration came with some pretty high losses for the Russians, and it became a kind of a mess with some of the encirclements that happened, you can still see that the difference between the Russian positions is only 16 kilometers. And that's being generous. So if we're talking about 15-kilometer difference between Russian positions, that's a lot to bet a city's life on, and all the soldiers that defend it, many of whom will be needed for future battles, as the war has no end in sight. Either way, though, expect continued Russian pressure throughout the winter. While I don't think it's going to be one gigantic wave at once, do expect the pressure to increase with time. But I do want to note, while I say the pressure is going to increase, the reason I don't think it's going to come in one big wave is they need to replenish losses. I showed you that video. That video is not an anomaly. Videos like that with those many losses strewn about is not very uncommon. So while there could be some more pressure, and that is to be expected, I expect that a lot of those forces being redeployed are also to replenish losses, which have been plentiful and expensive. Also, in Zaporizhia, the Russians bombed a residential apartment building in the Pisky neighborhood.
Сейчас умрем. А чё они тут кружат? Не знаю, но он сюда снегу. Нет, давай.
Every day. Russia never stopped last winter. Nope, they didn't stop last winter. I could expect them to maybe slow down to some when it comes to crossing large farm fields. But at the very least, I think the Russians want to enter Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka by winter, because if they make the fighting inside the city for the winter, then the greenery doesn't matter as much because you can run building to building. But if they have to run tree line to tree line through farm fields trying to get inside Konstantinivka, yeah, that's going to come with even higher casualties. And Russia does not want to get in the negative when it comes to its replenishment rate. Because right now, the Ukrainians are focusing on just disabling as many Russians as they can, grinding them down. That has become, like, they have started, like, a lot of the drone teams have started to make a lot more prioritization of Russian infantry and Russian personnel. So I need to show you guys some pretty terrible footage. So this is footage released by the Russian Ministry of Defense of them bombing deminers in the Chernihiv region. Now, the Chernihiv region has not seen active fighting since 2022, when the Russians invaded. Since then, the Russians left, and they did leave some unexploded ordnance behind. They did leave some mines behind, and there has been some other ordinances that have ended up in the region. Now, civilians still live in the region, and so civilian demining crews, like the one I embedded with and lived with for a month in Balaklia, a town in the Kharkiv region, after it was liberated, they operate in order to make it so that people don't walk out into, like, the little greenery near their house and explode. I've seen butterfly petal mines less than just a couple, if not 1 or 2 dozen kilometers away from the front porches of old grandmothers just living alone. That if they just took a walk one day and stepped in the wrong spot, bam. I've seen TM62 anti-tank mines buried on top of each other in people's backyards so it can blow up on the demining crews. I've seen the Russian equivalent of the Claymore tied to trees in the forest that keep setting off keep getting set off by dogs and other wildlife that they need to disable because it's on the same pathway as local power lines, And if they want energy, if this village wants energy, well, the repairman needs to go in there. But no repairman's going in there if it's infested with mines. So these civilian deminers allow people to return to their homes. And for the people who are going to return to their homes, because a lot of people are going to go to their homes whether you like it or not, they're there to try to clear the mines away enough from where civilians are living right now. Because there's so many mines, it's going to take probably most of my lifetime, if not all of my lifetime, to clear. At this point, where the war is now, even with trying to account for the innovations, you know, it's going to take quite a time. So they're just working on trying to get the butterfly mines and the mines out of the immediate vicinity of civilians, either coming back to their homes who always actively lived in their homes. And these civilian deminers are mostly Ukrainian, but some are international volunteers. I know Tip of the Spear is an example of an organization that does this, has done some work in people's farm fields and such like that. But in this case, these were Danish NGO workers, deminers, that were bombed by the Russian Ministry of Defense and killed while they were engaging in civilian demining in the Chernihiv region. Mind you, the reason we know about this isn't just because the Danish government has come out and mourned the loss of these people, and emergency services in Ukraine has come out and mourned the loss of these people, you know, civilian emergency services, you know, the same people who are like firefighters and go in and try to recover people in the aftermath of strikes. They mourned it. The Ukrainian government mourned it. But the reason I know about it is because I saw this video, which was posted after. I want this to be known, which was posted after it was announced that the people who were killed in these strikes were Danish NGO workers. So the footage you see is not only taken by the Russian Ministry of Defense and posted on the Russian Ministry of Defense channel, it was posted after it was announced that these were civilian deminers. And I do want to bring attention to the fact that this thing in the top right-hand corner is the Russian Ministry of Defense logo. This is not Rusich. This is not some individual Russian unit in Kherson that has posted footage to social media asking for donations. This isn't some bloodthirsty press officer who decided to make a funk edit while hunting aid workers. This is the official Russian Ministry of Defense, the big kahuna, the big account, boosting it on their social media platform after it was already announced that these were civilian deminers. Let me show you the footage that they posted. Eerily silent. Now, mind you, some of the reaction to this has been perplexing because I've seen a bunch of people who just don't understand how aid work like functions, where some people are like, why would you? Well, of course this happened. You're in an active war zone. What were you expecting? Aid workers work in active war zones, and the laws of war, which Russia itself has prescribed to, signed up
Burns
and
is
agreed
a
to,
morally corrupt,
was that, hey,
corrupt man.
you do not target aid workers who are trying to protect life and limb of civilians. I saw other people saying like, oh, so they're sappers. These are not people planting mines. These are not people whose job it is to plant mines that stop the Russian armed forces. Other people do that. There are people in the Ukrainian armed forces who do plant mines in order to stop the advance of the Russian armed forces. I've interviewed them on my channel, on my YouTube channel, on my main channel. If you want to go listen to the people who mined the Kiev region to stop the Russian advance in 2022, you can go listen to that on Dylan Burns TV. I've also interviewed press officers about their teams stopping Russian advances in the Luhansk region with mines. Like, this is not like there are deminers who do civilian aid work and remove mines to protect civilians, and then there are sappers whose jobs is not only to disable mines for Ukrainian advances and to protect their troops, but also to plant mines to do the exact opposite thing to the Russian army. So if people are confused at how aid work functions, or people are confused because they've never heard of civilian demining before, there is such a thing as civilian demining, and these people are 100% protected by the laws of war. And it's crazy enough that I even have to have this argument, that I have to say these things, but when the Russian government and the Russian Ministry of Defense is so bold as to openly post footage, eerily silent on social media, of their war crimes for everybody to see, after they fill Ukraine with so much unexploded ordinances that this war will be killing children a decade after its completion. That's why I have to just clarify that this is a war crime, that this is illegal, that this is the targeting of aid workers. And while I've seen the targeting of aid workers in Kherson firsthand, I've seen the wounds. I've seen my I've seen my friends laying in hospital beds after meeting the Russian army as aid workers. This continues to happen. And this one is particularly nauseous because I'm used to the Russians posting footage of their war crimes on social media before. I'm not used to them posting footage of their war crimes on the Russian Ministry of Defense account, the big kahuna, after it's publicly announced it's a war crime. It's usually before, as they try to control the narrative. But hey, these are Danish aid workers, not Americans, and the Danes are pretty hostile to Russia's war aims. Ukraine is going to open a weapons factory in Denmark as it tries to diversify its logistical intake to countries that cannot openly be bombed by the Russians outside of saboteur operations, which the Russians are actively engaged in throughout Europe and North America. But to them, maybe it's as simple as, if they're Danish and they're in the country, they're working towards Ukraine's war aims, and the Russians have bombed firefighters in Kherson, putting out fires from their strikes. The Russians have bombed ambulance drivers trying to recover civilians from the outcomes of their strike. If you can undercut the people living their lives in Ukraine and make them flee, then maybe you can undercut the foundation by which the state survives. Either way, I don't think this is going to change Danish action. The Danes have acted to this outrage. And if anything, I think this is just going to push Danish public sentiment further in favor of supporting the war, just like it would in any other country. Because if you bomb aid workers and then brag about it, bragging about murder is one way to let everyone know that you're a murderer. Mark Mark, thank you so much for the 5 gifted tier 1 subs.